Hello, and welcome to Midweek Murders, where we take a look at true crime around Australia. In this episode, we will be talking about the series of murders that put a little town in South Australia on the map. Although the murders are collectively known as the Snowtown murders, only one murder actually took place there, and the perpetrators did not even live there themselves. Between 1992 and 1999, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Velasquez murdered a total of 12 people in and around Adelaide, South Australia. The main motivation appears to be that the victims were suspected by the main perpetrator, John Bunting, as pedophiles or homosexuals. John had a wall in his home where he had a paper and wool web of suspects he believed to be pedophiles or homosexuals, from which he would pick his next targets. The infractions the victims had committed were imagined by John Bunting, largely based on flimsy evidence or rumours. Other reasons included obesity and drug usage. Most of the victims were people that Bunting or other members of his group knew personally, including family members. John Bunting was proven to be a psychopathic murderer who got satisfaction from the control of his victims, forcing them to address him as things such as God or Master. He also collected their Centrelink details and bank accounts and imitated the victims after death to receive their payments. A total of $97,200 was collected, but it is believed that money fraud was not the main motivation of the murders. Each murder is gruesome, so please be warned. The first victim was Clinton Trezze, who was bashed to death in John Bunting's living room after having been invited inside on the 31st of August 1992. John accused Clinton of being a pedophile, and after the murder referred to him as Happy Pants. Clinton's body was not found until 2 years later. He then appeared on 2 episodes of Australia's Most Wanted, which John Bunting watched together with James Velasquez and his mother, boasting that it was his handiwork, and revealing that he had been the murderer of Clinton. Next was Ray Davies in 1995. Ray was intellectually disabled and was in a relationship with John Bunting's ex-girlfriend, Suzanne Allen, in 1993. Suzanne's grandsons accused Ray Davies of making sexual advances on them, and Suzanne ended the relationship, although she remained friends with Ray, allowing him to live in a caravan parked in her backyard. On Boxing Day of 1995, Suzanne's daughter, Annette Cannon, saw John Bunting and Suzanne emptying Ray's caravan. John later revealed to James Velasquez that he had murdered Ray on Christmas Day. The murder had started with James Velasquez's mother and John's wife, Elizabeth Harvey, stabbing Ray Davies in the leg before their mutual friend, Robert Wagner, strangled Ray to unconsciousness with jumper cables. Apparently, following that, John Bunting and Robert Wagner loaded Ray Davies' body into the boot of a car and drove out to a residence in Bucara, South Australia, where they tossed Ray's body into a bathtub and bashed him in the genitals until he died. Ray's body was not found until May 1999, where it was discovered in a grave filled with bricks, soil and concrete on a property previously occupied by John in Salisbury, South Australia. Suzanne Allen was next, although her death was concealed by John Bunting. He had alleged that she had died of a heart attack, although law enforcement believed that it was murder. John continued to collect her pension past her death, amassing a total of $17,000. However, murder allegations were dropped due to the lack of evidence, and the perpetrators were found not guilty. This case was never tried again. However, they did find her body buried at John Bunting's house in Salisbury North in 1999. Michelle Gardner, who disappeared in 1997, was a young transgender woman who lived with Robert Wagner's wife's cousin. John Bunting referred to her as the biggest, perhaps leading to the outrage Robert Wagner felt witnessing Michelle playing with his children in her front yard. She had grabbed one of the children and placed her hand over the child's mouth, which outraged Robert Wagner. He and John Bunting took Michelle to Murray Bridge in South Australia, where they strangled her in a shed and forced her to stand up each time she collapsed. Her body was kept in a barrel in the shed until it was moved to an empty bank in Snowtown, South Australia, where it was discovered on the 20th of May 1999. Her foot had been cut off to allow the lid of the barrel to be properly closed. Vanessa Lane was another transgender woman, who was Robert Wagner's ex-partner. They were together when they first met John Bunting in Salisbury North in 1991. John Bunting had only accepted her into his circle of friends because she informed him of the comings and goings of local pedophiles. Vanessa was accused of molesting a local boy, and her and Robert Wagner's house was firebombed, and Robert left her. In 1997, Thomas Trevelyan, whom Vanessa had started a relationship with, moved in with her. Thomas had told John Bunting that Vanessa had been sexually abusing him, and on the 17th of October 1997, John Bunting, along with Robert Wagner and Thomas Trevelyan, picked Vanessa up and forced her to call her mother, where she verbally abused her and said that she never wanted to have anything to do with her again. Her mother could hear Thomas in the background prompting Vanessa to say horrible things to her. After the phone call, Vanessa was tortured for her bank details by crushing her toe with pliers. They then strangled her to death. John Bunting took control of her car and settling payments, and her body was not discovered until 1999 in a barrel in the bank vault in Snowtown. Naturally, Thomas Trevelyan's death followed Vanessa's. He suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and in one incident he had chased a dog that Robert Wagner's girlfriend's son was playing with a knife in an attempt to kill it. John Bunting told the others that Thomas was going mental and that he was a liability to them. John Bunting and Robert Wagner took Thomas to Hurstbrook in the Adelaide Hills and forced him to lean on a box and put a noose around his neck. Due to Thomas's previous attempts at suicide, when his body was discovered the next day, it was assumed that he had killed himself. In 1997, James Velasquez made a new friend, Gavin Porter, who was diagnosed as schizophrenic and had spent many years in mental institutions. After his mother died, he moved to Adelaide where he met James, and when Velasquez and his family moved to Murray Bridge, Gavin moved with them. John Bunting thought that Gavin was a waste who didn't deserve to live, as he was a heroin addict. On one occasion, John was pricked by a syringe left over by Gavin, and thus Gavin was selected as the next victim. John attacked Gavin in his sleep, and although Gavin was able to stab John in the hand with a screwdriver, John overpowered and strangled him. John showed off the corpse to James Velasquez before dumping it in a barrel, which was discovered along with the other barrels in 1999. James Velasquez also had a half-brother, Troy Yode, who became the next victim. James had confided in John that Troy had sexually abused him when he was 13 years old. One night, John Bunting and Robert Wagner woke James up and told him that they were going to kill Troy. They beat up Troy while he was asleep in bed, having James handcuff him while they tied him up. They forced Troy into the bathroom, where they beat him until he gave up his financial details. John used pliers to crush Troy's toes as he recorded him saying his personal details. They then killed Troy by strangling him. John Bunting had used Troy's recordings, and later from his other victims, to create messages to friends and family that they would be going away. Troy's body was also found amongst the barrels in 1999. Frederick Brooks, who was the relative of Mark Hayden, the man responsible for hiding the bodies in the empty bank, was John Bunting's next target. John was obsessed with the idea that Fred was touching up young girls, and said that something had to happen to him. In September of 1998, Fred was told he had been accepted into the Australian Air Force Cadets, and John invited him to a party to celebrate, where John, Robert, and James tortured Fred in a bathtub, handcuffing him as with previous victims. Frederick also had lit cigarettes forced into his ears and nostrils, and a sparkler shoved into his urethra. He was also recorded, tortured into giving his bank details. He was then injected with bleach in the testicles, which were wired to a device that sent electric shocks through his body. As with previous victims, his toes were crushed with pliers, and he ended up choking to death on his gag. His body was also amongst those found in barrels in 1999. Also in 1998, Gary O'Dwyer, a mentally and physically disabled neighbour of John's, became the next target. John constantly called Gary a fag, and later John got James Velasquez to garner details regarding Gary's financial situation, and if he had any family around. Gary then became a financial target, and John Bunting insisted that James Velasquez invite Gary for drinks with them. They took him to Francis Street, Murray Bridge, in South Australia, where they got Gary drunk and then strangled and tortured him. They then took Gary's body to Mark Hayden's home and placed it in a barrel, adding to the eventual bodies found in the Snowtown bank vault. Eventually, Mark Hayden told his wife, Elizabeth, about the murders, and John Bunting made her the next target. John already didn't like Elizabeth, and warned James Velasquez that she was a problem because she knew about the murders. Robert Wagner agreed, already considering Elizabeth to be a whore and a lowlife. On an evening where Mark had taken the kids out and Elizabeth was left home alone, John Bunting and Robert Wagner went to the home and dragged Elizabeth into the bathroom, where they tortured her to death. She was left with a rope around her neck and a gag in her mouth. Apparently, when Mark had arrived home and saw his wife's remains, he laughed. Elizabeth was put in a barrel as well. The final victim, David Johnson, was James Velasquez's stepbrother, who was greatly disliked by John Bunting for being a yuppie and a due to his care with his personal appearance. John arranged with James to take David to the bank in Snowtown in 1999, where they overpowered and murdered him. He was the only victim to actually die in Snowtown, where the rest of the bodies were discovered 11 days later. John Bunting and Robert Wagner had fried and eaten a piece of David's body. A total of 8 bodies were found in the bank vault in Snowtown in 1999. Although 2 of the murders had been discovered prior to this, they were dismissed as not related to John Bunting. It wasn't until the investigation into Mark's wife, Elizabeth Hayden's death, that led police to Snowtown. Police believe that the bodies in the barrels had been hosted at several different locations around South Australia, with their final destination being the empty bank vault in Snowtown. The only murder John Bunting was not arrested for was that of Susan Allen, as the jury could not reach a verdict. That said, John Bunting was identified as the ringleader and sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Robert Wagner was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences without parole, and at his sentencing he said, "Pedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action. I took that action. Thank you." James Velasquez was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences with a non-parole period of 26 years, and Mark Hayden was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 18 years. In February of 2024, Mark was granted parole and now lives in a pre-release centre in Adelaide. Thanks for tuning in to Midweek Murders. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Links will be in the description below if you want to learn more. Until next week, stay safe.